My brother turned me into a family joke, but I destroyed his perfect life at his own party, and then. I've always known that I wasn't the favorite. It wasn't something anyone ever said outright, but the way people treated me compared to my brother made it obvious. Brandon had always been the golden child, the one who shined at family gatherings, the one who made people laugh without even trying, the one who walked into a room and owned it without effort. He was the guy everyone wanted to be around. Meanwhile, I was the one they tolerated. The quiet one. The one who, from an early age, was labeled as too sensitive, as if feeling things deeply was a personal flaw. For as long as I can remember, I've struggled with depression. Not the kind where you feel a little down for a few days and then bounce back. The kind that wraps around you like a weight, making it nearly impossible to get out of bed. The kind that turns simple tasks into uphill battles, making you question if anything is worth the effort. I've been in therapy, tried medication, and even spent time in a hospital when things got bad enough. But my family never understood. My parents didn't believe in mental health. They thought it was just something weak people used as an excuse. Every time I struggled, they dismissed it with the same tired phrases: snap out of it, stop feeling sorry for yourself, you just need to try harder. After years of hearing it, I started to believe them. Maybe I was just lazy. Maybe I was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. Maybe if I were stronger, I wouldn't feel this way at all. Brandon never struggled the way I did. Or at least, that's what I thought. He was the kind of person who made life look effortless. People naturally gravitated toward him. He knew how to say the right things, how to charm a room, how to make our parents beam with pride. He excelled at everything he did. School, sports, socializing. There was nothing he wasn't good at. And because he was perfect, I was the contrast. I was the one who wasn't trying hard enough. The one who was too emotional. The one who needed to stop making excuses. For years, I kept my head down. I didn't push back. I didn't argue. I just accepted that this was how things were, that I was always going to be the disappointment of the family. But then everything changed. It started with something so small that, at first, I didn't even notice it. I left a family dinner early because I felt overwhelmed. Too much noise, too many people, that crushing feeling of being surrounded but completely alone. I didn't think it was a big deal. I made my excuses, went home, and figured that was the end of it. But the next time I saw my family, something was different. The warmth that had always been there, even if it was never as strong as what Brandon received, was gone. Conversations that used to include me suddenly didn't. The way people looked at me had changed. I noticed the way my aunt, who had always been kind to me, now gave me a look that was somewhere between pity and skepticism. The way my cousins whispered to each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was reading into things too much. But then one of my cousins let something slip. Apparently, Brandon had told everyone that I was faking my depression. He had spun some story about how I exaggerated everything for attention, how I used mental health as a way to get sympathy. According to him, I was one of those people who cried about anxiety and depression just to get out of responsibilities. And the worst part? They all believed him. I confronted him over text. I didn't come at him angry or accusing. I just asked, straight up, why he would say something like that about me. His response was so casual it made my stomach turn. You take everything so seriously. I was just making conversation. If people believe everything they hear, that's on them. No apology. No regret. Nothing. Just a brush off. Like my entire reputation in the family wasn't something he had just set on fire. After that, everything got worse. Family gatherings became unbearable. If I so much as mentioned mental health, my mother would change the subject so fast it gave me whiplash. My father told me to let it go, that I was dwelling on the past. But how could I? No one believed me anymore. No matter what I said, no matter how I tried to explain, I was the boy who cried wolf. It didn't matter how much I had struggled. It didn't matter that I had been in therapy for years, that I had spent nights staring at my ceiling wondering if things would ever get better. To them, it was all an act. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Brandon announced his engagement. Olivia was everything my parents wanted for him. She came from a wealthy, well-connected family. She was polished, elegant, and completely adored him. Their engagement was a huge deal. My parents wanted to throw them the kind of party that people talked about for years. Lavish, extravagant, something that would make them look good in the eyes of their social circle. And of course, I was expected to be there, smiling, celebrating, playing the part of the supportive brother as if nothing had happened. I vented to my best friend, Adrian, about all of it. He was furious. He had always seen through Brandon's bullshit in a way that I never could. "He's projecting," Adrian said. "People who go out of their way to discredit someone else's pain, they usually have something to hide." At the time, I brushed it off. Brandon had never struggled a day in his life. He had never been weak, never been uncertain, never been anything less than perfect. What could he possibly have to hide? I didn't realize how wrong I was until a week before the engagement party. I was staying at my parents' house for the night because I had an early morning appointment nearby. I went into the guest room, Brandon's old room, to look for a charger. While rummaging through the nightstand, I noticed a small leather notebook buried under a stack of papers. At first, I ignored it. It wasn't mine to read. But when I went to close the drawer, curiosity won. I pulled it out, flipped it open, and started skimming the first few pages. And that's when I saw it. His handwriting. His words. Page after page filled with self-doubt, insecurity, fear. Descriptions of sleepless nights, of panic attacks, of feeling like a fraud. He wrote about how exhausting it was to pretend everything was fine, how he felt like he was cracking under the pressure. Brandon had been in therapy for years. The same brother who had laughed at me, who had convinced our family that I was making everything up, had been battling the same demons in secret. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at it. I wanted to confront him, throw it in his face, demand an explanation. But then a different thought crept in. The engagement party was in a few days. Brandon had destroyed my credibility. Maybe it was time he got a taste of his own medicine. The day of the engagement party arrived, and I could already feel the tension crawling under my skin before I even walked through the doors. My parents had been buzzing about this night for weeks, obsessing over every last detail to ensure everything was perfect. It was being held at some ridiculous venue, the kind of place where the chandeliers probably cost more than my entire apartment. A live string quartet played softly in the background. People sipped expensive champagne while pretending they weren't judging each other, and everything about the atmosphere screamed wealth and status. This wasn't just a celebration of Brandon and Olivia's relationship. It was a carefully curated display of perfection. The second I stepped inside, I could tell I was unwelcome. I wasn't being openly ignored, but the shift was undeniable. People who had once greeted me with warmth now gave me polite, forced smiles that barely lasted a second. Some didn't even bother with that much effort. Conversations that had always included me now continued as if I weren't standing right there. I could feel eyes on me from across the room, watching, whispering, making their little comments about how pathetic it was that I had actually shown up. I made my way toward the bar, pretending I didn't notice the way two of my cousins immediately lowered their voices as I walked past them. Their laughter was hushed, but not enough to completely drown out what they were saying. "It's honestly so embarrassing," one of them muttered. "He really still thinks anyone takes him seriously? Some people just love being victims," the other replied, smirking as he took a sip of his drink. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep walking. The worst part wasn't even their words. It was the way they had the confidence to say it in a room full of people, knowing no one would call them out. Brandon had done his job well. He had made sure that I was the family joke, the one everyone could mock without consequence. Near the buffet table, two of my aunts were chatting quietly, their expressions amused in that way people get when they think they're discussing something beneath them. One of them tilted her head toward me, pretending she wasn't looking directly in my direction. "I just think if someone was really struggling, they wouldn't be posting about it," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "People like that just love drama." Her friend nodded, sipping her wine as if they were discussing something as trivial as the weather. Laughter from across the room pulled my attention, and my stomach twisted when I saw him. Brandon stood in the center of a group, his perfect smile in place, laughing effortlessly at something someone had just said. He looked completely at ease, completely in control, basking in the admiration of the people surrounding him. And just like that, I felt it all over again. That familiar, suffocating feeling of being completely invisible while he got to shine. But not tonight. Dinner was served, and people took their seats, still buzzing with conversation. The speeches started shortly after, with Olivia's maid of honor standing first to talk about their perfect relationship, their fairy tale romance, and how lucky she was to have found someone like Brandon. After that, Olivia's father spoke about love, commitment, and the importance of family. Everything was moving along exactly as planned, every piece of the night falling into place exactly the way Brandon wanted it to. Then he stood up. He raised his glass, smiling that same easy, confident smile that had always won people over. His voice carried across the room with practiced charm, smooth and effortless, like someone who had spent years perfecting the art of public speaking. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said, pausing just long enough for people to nod and murmur their approval. "It really means the world to Olivia and me to be surrounded by so many people who love and support us." I could already tell he was leading up to something. That smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth wasn't there for no reason. And, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my brother. His eyes landed on me, glinting with something sharp. "Marcus, I truly hope you find something real to be sad about one day." The room erupted in soft chuckles, the kind that people give when they know they probably shouldn't laugh, but do anyway. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly unsure whether this was funny or just cruel. But Brandon didn't care. He took a slow sip of his champagne, looking at me as if daring me to say something. And that was it. That was the moment I stopped caring about whether I was doing the right thing. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small leather-bound book. There was a natural lull in conversation, the kind of brief silence that happens in a crowded room when people pause between discussions. I took that opportunity, rising from my chair and tapping my glass with the edge of a fork. The sound was sharp, cutting through the low hum of voices. "Since we're being honest tonight," I said, my voice steady, "let's talk about mental health." The room shifted. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward me. Across the table, Brandon stiffened, his grip tightening around his champagne glass as his smile faltered. He was fast, but not fast enough to hide the flicker of unease in his expression. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, just loud enough for me to hear. I flipped open the journal, my fingers moving through the pages as if I were simply reading a passage from a book. "The weight of expectation is crushing," I began, my voice carrying through the silent room. "Some nights, I lie awake, feeling like I'm suffocating under the pressure. No one sees me. No one knows how much effort it takes to smile, to act normal, to be the person everyone expects me to be." The air in the room grew heavy. Someone coughed awkwardly. Someone else shifted in their seat. But no one spoke. Brandon's face drained of color. I continued flipping through the pages, reading select passages, the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the overwhelming fear of being a disappointment. His deepest insecurities, his private thoughts, his hidden struggles. The exact same things he had spent months mocking me for. Brandon shot up from his chair so quickly that his glass nearly tipped over. "Shut up," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You had no right to." I took a step back as he lunged forward, trying to snatch the journal from my hands. Gasps echoed through the hall. Someone in the back murmured something, their voice too low to hear. I didn't stop. David, Olivia's father, cleared his throat, his face unreadable as he glanced between the two of us. His voice was measured, but there was an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "Is this true?" Brandon froze. Olivia turned to him, her expression no longer one of adoration, but uncertainty. The whispers started again, louder this time. Some people exchanged glances, clearly unsettled. The same aunts who had dismissed me earlier now looked distinctly uncomfortable. The cousins who had mocked me suddenly avoided my gaze. David slowly placed his glass down, his expression tightening. "We'll talk about this later," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Brandon turned to me, eyes burning with something between rage and humiliation. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists as if willing himself to keep it together. I met his stare, my voice calm. Neither did you. And just like that, the illusion of his perfect life shattered. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath unfold because I had already seen everything I needed to see. The moment Olivia's father told Brandon they would talk later, I knew the damage had been done. There was no quick recovery from this, no charming his way out of what had just happened. The perfect image he had spent his entire life building had cracked wide open, and for the first time, everyone in the room could see the truth. I grabbed my bag, walked past the stunned faces of my relatives, and stepped out into the cold night air without looking back. As I made my way toward my car, I could feel the adrenaline still buzzing through my veins. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, replaying every detail of the moment I had spent years waiting for. He had humiliated me, destroyed my credibility, turned my own family against me without a second thought, and he had never once imagined that I would fight back. He had built his entire existence on the idea that he was untouchable, that no matter what he did, he would always come out on top. But tonight, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. I turned my phone on silent the second I got inside my apartment because I already knew the messages would start pouring in the moment I left. I didn't want to hear my parents calling to demand an explanation. I didn't want to listen to my aunts lecturing me about how I had ruined a beautiful night. I didn't need to see my cousins trying to decide whether they should be outraged or if they should quietly distance themselves from Brandon now that the truth had come out. For the first time in a long time, I didn't care what any of them thought. By the next morning, the disaster of the engagement party had already exploded far beyond that banquet hall. Brandon wasted no time trying to spin the story in his favor, flooding social media with dramatic posts about betrayal, family turning against family, and the cruelty of those who just wanted to see others fail. He painted himself as the victim, the heartbroken brother who had his private thoughts stolen and exposed by someone who had always been jealous of him. His friends, the ones who had always blindly followed him, immediately jumped to his defense, filling his comment section with outrage. Some went as far as to say they had always known I was unstable, that I had always been looking for a way to bring him down because I couldn't stand his success. But something interesting started happening that I don't think Brandon expected. People weren't just blindly defending him. Some of his own friends started asking questions, poking holes in his carefully crafted sob story. They started pointing out that he had been the one making fun of my mental health for months, the one who had gone out of his way to convince everyone that I was faking my depression. A few even admitted that they were shocked he had a therapy journal at all, considering how much effort he had put into tearing me down for being open about my struggles. My inbox was full before noon. Some of my relatives, mostly the ones who had always been closer to Brandon, accused me of taking things too far, insisting that I should have been the bigger person and let it go. They told me it was just a joke, that I had no right to expose something so personal, that I had gone out of my way to destroy him when I could have simply walked away. But others, the ones who had never fully believed Brandon's stories in the first place, quietly reached out to me. A few cousins admitted they had always felt something was off about how he treated me, but they had been too afraid to say anything. One of my aunts, the same woman who had laughed along with the rest of them when Brandon made his jokes at my expense, actually called me. Her voice lacked the usual smugness I had grown used to over the years, replaced with something almost hesitant. She admitted she had believed Brandon's version of things because it was easier, because it was more comfortable to think that I was just overreacting rather than to acknowledge that he might have been cruel on purpose. She didn't outright apologize, but the fact that she had called at all told me everything I needed to know. For the first time, Brandon wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Later that evening, I got an unexpected call from Olivia's father. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me of anything. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he asked if the journal was real, if Brandon had truly been in therapy for years without telling anyone. I told him the truth, that I had found it at our parents' house, that I hadn't even planned to read it until Brandon had gone out of his way to humiliate me again. If he wanted to know more, he needed to ask Brandon himself. He was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "Thank you," and hanging up. I didn't hear from him again after that, but later that night, A mutual friend of Brandon mentioned in passing that Olivia's father had spoken to her privately. Apparently, she had gone to bed alone, and Brandon hadn't come back to their apartment. Instead, he had checked into a hotel. That was the first real sign that things were crumbling for him. Meanwhile, Brandon was getting more desperate. The messages started coming in nonstop, swinging between rage and pleading. 1 minute, he was calling me bitter and pathetic, saying I had always been jealous of him and that I had finally shown my true colors. The next, he was practically begging me to fix things, saying that I had ruined his life, that I needed to make it right before everything completely fell apart. He didn't seem to grasp that there was no fixing this, that there was no way to take back what had already been done. Then, the real blow came. Brandon worked in finance, an industry where reputation mattered more than anything else. The engagement party scandal wasn't headline news, but whispers about it spread quickly through his social circles. Someone from his workplace, a friend of a friend, mentioned that the gossip was starting to affect how his bosses viewed him. While they hadn't taken any official action, the scrutiny was making him nervous. No company wanted an employee whose personal life was turning into a spectacle. By the third day after the engagement party, he was unraveling. He started deleting his social media posts, but it was too late. Screenshots had already been taken, people were already talking, and the damage had already been done. His friends, the ones who had blindly defended him at first, started backing away. Olivia still hadn't spoken to him, and his attempts to reach her were being ignored. Even my parents, who had always been on his side no matter what, were growing uncomfortable with how public everything had become. That was when they decided to step in. I got the call from my mother first. She insisted that Brandon and I needed to fix things, that this had gone on long enough, that it was time to sit down as a family and move past everything. My father was more direct, saying that I needed to apologize and put an end to all of this before it got worse. I just sat there, listening to them talk about family, about forgiveness, about how things had escalated too far. They didn't mention the fact that Brandon had spent months making sure I was completely isolated. They didn't bring up how he had actively convinced everyone that I was faking my depression, that he had humiliated me at every opportunity while they stood by and did nothing. None of that mattered to them. What mattered was that now, for the first time, Brandon was facing consequences. And that, in their eyes, was unacceptable. When I told them I wouldn't apologize, my mother's voice wavered with disbelief, as if she truly couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to make this easier for them. My father muttered that he had never raised us to be like this. But I wasn't the one who had started this, and I wasn't the one who was going to fix it. Brandon's perfect life was slipping away, and for the first time, there was no easy way for him to spin the situation in his favor. Olivia still hadn't spoken to him. His job was now under scrutiny, and the family, once so eager to defend him, was starting to distance themselves. He had spent his entire life building an image of effortless success, carefully crafting the version of himself that he wanted the world to see. But now, with everything unraveling, that image was beginning to crack, and no matter how hard he tried to control the damage, it wasn't enough. The silence from Olivia was driving him into a full-blown panic. He had always been able to charm his way out of trouble, always been able to smooth things over with the right words, the right gestures, the right amount of carefully placed remorse. But this time, it wasn't working. Olivia had seen something that she couldn't unsee, something that no apology or explanation could erase. She hadn't just left the engagement party early. She had completely removed herself from the situation, refusing to answer his calls, his texts, or the endless stream of messages he was leaving on every platform he could reach her on. By the second day of being ignored, he snapped. He showed up at her apartment unannounced, pounding on the door, ringing the bell over and over again like sheer persistence would force her to let him in. When no one answered, he started calling her from different numbers, desperate for any kind of response. A neighbor saw him pacing outside the building, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself between frustrated sighs. Eventually, someone let him inside, but Olivia wasn't there. She had already anticipated that he would do this, and she had made sure he wouldn't find her. That only made him more desperate. Meanwhile, Our parents were in full damage control mode, but their version of fixing things had nothing to do with holding Brandon accountable for what he had done. Instead, they turned their attention to me, placing the blame exactly where they had always been the most comfortable putting it. I lost count of how many times they called, their voices growing more frustrated with every ignored attempt. When I finally picked up, my father didn't waste any time getting to the point. "This is getting out of hand," he said, his voice heavy with expectation. "You need to fix what you started." I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it, at the way he so effortlessly rewrote history to make it seem as if I had somehow created this disaster from nothing. Brandon had spent months making sure I had no support, convincing everyone that I was faking my depression, turning me into a joke that no one took seriously. He had made sure I had no way to defend myself, no voice, no credibility. And now that he was facing real consequences for the first time in his life, I was supposed to step in and clean up his mess? Not happening. Brandon, however, wasn't done trying to manipulate the situation. A few days after my parents' failed attempt to pressure me into an apology, I got a message from him that was so uncharacteristically calm that I knew, before even reading the first full sentence, that he was trying a new tactic. Instead of the usual anger, instead of the desperate accusations that I had ruined his life, this time he was playing the role of someone who had finally seen the error of his ways. "I get it now," he wrote, his words carefully crafted to sound like some profound revelation. "I understand why you're angry. I know I made mistakes, and I know I hurt you. But this has gone too far. I need your help." There it was. The shift. The plea. The expectation that, despite everything, I would still feel obligated to pull him out of the hole he had dug for himself. When I didn't respond, the messages kept coming, each one getting progressively more desperate. "If you had just talked to me in private, none of this would have happened," he insisted, trying to twist the situation so that I was the one who had overreacted. "You didn't have to do this in front of everyone. You didn't have to humiliate me." Humiliation was exactly what he had wanted for me. He had spent months making sure I was the family joke, making sure every whispered comment and backhanded remark chipped away at what little dignity I had left. But the second the roles were reversed, the second he was the one being judged, he couldn't handle it. I didn't bother responding because I knew that if I did, he would only see it as an opening. And, sure enough, when I ignored him, his tone shifted again. The carefully worded apologies disappeared, replaced with anger, frustration, a familiar bitterness that he had never been able to fully hide. "You've always been like this," he wrote, the calm facade slipping away entirely. "Always waiting for an opportunity to make yourself the victim, always blaming everyone else for your own failures. You think you've won? You think you've somehow come out on top? You haven't won anything. You've just proven that you're exactly who I always said you were." I stared at the message for a long time before finally closing my phone. I had spent years trying to understand why he was the way he was, why he had always felt the need to keep me beneath him, why he had gone out of his way to destroy me. But in the end, none of it really mattered. He wasn't going to change, and I wasn't going to waste another second trying to fix something that had been broken beyond repair for years. He must have realized that he wasn't going to get a response from me because, shortly after, he turned his desperation toward Olivia. She had already made it clear that she needed space, that she wasn't ready to talk, that she wasn't interested in whatever excuses he had lined up. But that didn't stop him from trying. At first, he apologized. Then, when that didn't work, he tried shifting the blame, telling her that I had set him up, that I had always wanted to ruin his life, that I had twisted everything out of context. When she still didn't respond, he got angrier, accusing her of being weak, of giving up on him over something so small, of not understanding what it was like to have everyone turn against you. She stayed silent. Then, after days of trying to force a reaction out of her, he got one. A single message. "You need to move on. I will not be manipulated." Then she blocked him. That was the moment everything fully unraveled. With no way to reach her, no way to salvage the engagement, no way to convince her that he was still the person she had agreed to marry, Brandon started losing what little control he had left. He messaged her friends, trying to get them to talk to her on his behalf. He called her work, pretending it was urgent. He started showing up in places he thought she might be, hoping she would run into him and be forced to talk. The family, once so adamant about defending him, started seeing him for what he truly was. My parents, who had spent days trying to force me to fix everything, suddenly went quiet. They didn't apologize, but they stopped calling, stopped pressuring me, stopped pretending that Brandon was some innocent victim. For the first time in his life, he had lost. And the best part? He had done it to himself. Brandon didn't disappear quietly because he was never the type to accept defeat with any level of grace. He convinced himself that I was the reason his engagement had fallen apart, that if I had never read his journal, if I had never exposed him in front of our family, if I had never turned people against him, he would still have everything. In his mind, none of this was his fault. None of this was the result of his own choices. None of this had anything to do with the fact that he had spent months trying to destroy my credibility, that he had spent years carefully controlling how people saw him while making sure I was always the contrast, the lesser one, the failure. Our parents clung to that belief too, choosing to see him as the victim rather than acknowledging the reality of the situation. They saw their eldest son crumbling, his perfect life unraveling in real time, and instead of holding him accountable, they did what they had always done. They defended him. When my mother called again, her voice carried none of the softness of before. She was no longer trying to convince me to help him out of concern. Now, it was about obligation. She insisted that I should publicly clarify things, that I should tell people I had exaggerated, that I had misunderstood, that it was all just a terrible mistake. When I refused, my father took the phone and told me that I had gone too far, that no matter what Brandon had done, no matter what had happened between us, family was supposed to protect family. I ignored them. But Brandon wasn't going to wait for me to fix things for him. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door like he expected me to either let him in or break under the pressure. I debated not answering, but I knew that if I didn't, he would just keep coming back, escalating until I had no choice but to deal with him one way or another. When I finally opened the door, I barely recognized the person standing in front of me. His usually perfect appearance was gone, replaced with something disheveled, something almost frantic. His suit was wrinkled, his tie missing, his hair a mess like he had run his hands through it too many times. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was an exhaustion in his face that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The moment he stepped inside, he launched into a rant, pacing the length of my living room, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. He didn't start with an apology, didn't even pretend that he was here to make things right. Instead, he demanded that I undo what I had done, that I go to Olivia and explain that I had twisted everything out of context, that I had deliberately made him look worse than he really was. He acted like all it would take was a single conversation for me to make everything go back to the way it was before, like my words alone held the power to undo all the damage he had caused himself. I just stood there, watching him unravel, letting him run out of things to say, waiting for him to finally realize that I wasn't going to save him. When he finally stopped, his breathing heavy, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, I met his gaze and told him the truth. He never cared when he was destroying my credibility, never cared when he made sure no one believed me, never cared when he turned me into a joke. He had no problem lying about my mental health, making sure I had no support, making sure I had nothing. But now that he was the one facing consequences, he suddenly wanted fairness, suddenly wanted to be understood, suddenly wanted to be seen as something other than the villain. He scoffed at first, flipping back into his usual arrogance, rolling his eyes like none of this actually mattered, like he wasn't actually affected. He claimed that Olivia was nothing more than a status move, that he hadn't even cared about marrying her, that this wasn't even a real loss. But then, slowly, the cracks started to show. His voice wavered, his hands shook, his composure slipped piece by piece as he realized that I wasn't buying into his act. For the first time, he had no control over the situation. When he saw that there was nothing left to say, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard behind him that the frame rattled. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known that Brandon wasn't done trying to fix things in the only way he knew how, by forcing them back into place. He turned his desperation back toward Olivia, leaving voicemails filled with rehearsed regret, sending long messages about how he had been overwhelmed, how he had made mistakes, how he still loved her. When that didn't work, he started shifting the blame, telling her that I had set him up, that I had always been waiting for a chance to tear him down, that none of this would have happened if she had just stood by him. But she didn't respond. When the messages stopped being about guilt and started being about anger, she blocked him. That sent him spiraling even further. Unable to reach her directly, he resorted to messaging her friends, trying to find some way to force himself back into her life. He started showing up at places she used to go, hoping to run into her, hoping to force a conversation. He started telling people that I had exaggerated what I read, that I had intentionally left out the parts that would have made him look better, that I had deliberately twisted his words into something they weren't. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. Some people hesitated, some family members wondered if maybe he had a point, if maybe I had taken things too far, if maybe I had been so focused on revenge that I hadn't considered the full picture. But then, the final blow came. Olivia, who had remained silent for so long, finally spoke up. She didn't post some dramatic message, didn't go on social media to defend herself, didn't try to explain herself to people who had already made up their minds. Instead, she reached out privately to the people who mattered, making one simple thing clear. She had seen the journal, she had seen his reaction, she had seen his unraveling, and she had made the decision to walk away because of him, not because of me. That was the final nail in the coffin. The family members who had been holding on to doubt let go of it. The people who had still been defending him backed away. Even his closest friends, the ones who had always been in his corner, stopped speaking up for him. Brandon had lost everything. And for the first time in my life, I was free. He eventually moved to a different city, hoping for a fresh start, hoping that distance would erase the damage. But the truth had already settled too deep. He spent more time looking over his shoulder than actually rebuilding his life. Always paranoid that people knew what had happened, always waiting for someone to bring it up, always convinced that his past would follow him no matter where he went. I, on the other hand, finally moved on. The family would never fully be the same, but I no longer needed their approval. I no longer cared about their judgment, their whispers, their opinions. Brandon had spent years trying to keep me beneath him, trying to make sure I was always the one people looked down on. But in the end, the only life he ruined was his own. Even now, years later, people still talk about that night. Guests from the engagement party still whisper about the scandal, about the journal, about how, in the span of a few minutes, the perfect golden child lost everything. And no matter how far Brandon runs, he will never live it down.